Hello, this is a video about inserting, updating, and deleting data. We will also use merge to merge rows from a table to another table. All right, let's look first into the select into statement. If you forget about this line, the into line, it is basically a select statement. So select some columns from table and you can do where, you can do group by, having, and order by. Now into gives a target, so this table will be created if and yeah, when it does not exist. So let me show you. I already copied an example and ran this example. So this created an invoice copy table from invoices, and we can look at it, find it in our list of tables. Here it is. And I would like to carefully compare it to the original invoices table. Okay, so first of all, the columns are exactly the same, but you may notice over here that there is no information about primary keys and foreign keys. That is how the select into works. So it does copy the data, it does copy the column data types and specifications, but it does not copy the keys. So that is the first thing for you to notice. We can also create a partial copy, so we can basically filter the results. In this case, this difference represents balance due, as we have seen many times earlier. So that could be your the table old invoices. Now create table, we can create table with summary rows, because in this kind of select into statement we can still use group by. So this query is grouping by vendor ID, which means that for every different distinct vendor ID, we're computing sum of invoice total and calling it sum of invoices. And before that, we're filtering on choosing only the balance dues not equal to 0. And after we are done playing with a table, with a copy table that we created, we can always delete it. And yes, this is a warning that I told you about earlier. Only the column definition and data are copied. Primary keys, foreign keys, default values are not included in the new table. Now let us move on to an insert statement. Insert into table, column list, default values, and so on. So we can do values, insert values, or we can do a subquery here, and that is what we will see in the next. So I just ran an example from the slides, insert into invoice copy. So we're adding this information, and the order of this entries basically correspond to the order of the columns. However, there is a couple of things here that you need to know. And let me, for the sake of the example, show you what the table consists of. So the first column is invoice ID. This is a column that is automatically generated. This is an ID column. That is why in the previous query we did not have to specify the value for it. All right, let us move on. So we wanted to enter this data, and maybe I should have showed that first. Basically, we have columns and we have entries for those columns. For invoice ID, it is generated automatically because that's how ID column works. And other ones we can specify, um, and we can use null values where we are allowed to do that. So this is what I actually copied, and you can see that it did work. And alternatively, we could use explicitly a column list. So for columns, this list of columns, we are entering values. How that can be beneficial? Sometimes, not specifically in this invoice copy, we have specified default values. And if we specify default values, we can skip the corresponding column name and corresponding value if we just want default value like zeros. So that could end up being a little bit more efficient at times. Not in this case. As I was saying, default values were not copied into invoice copy. And yes, we can look at the similar statement, and in this way, using values, we can enter 3 rows into the invoice copy. 3 distinct rows into the invoice copy. Before I proceed, I want you to see what I showed you sometime earlier. If I run this a few times, it's going to add a line to the table, invoice copy, again and again. So be careful and be aware of that. So let us look at it again. Yeah, and just to finish with it, invoice copy had no information about keys, and invoices did have information about keys. Here it is. So also in columns, the names and the data types and now or not now, all those choices are the same, but here you can see the primary key and foreign keys information in the invoices, but not in the invoice copy. All right, that's another example. So we have column names, data types, length, identity. That is all we need to know about each column name and what is allowed, for example, and what data types are expected in these columns. And we will learn to do this, to specify all that a little later. Well, let's see. This is a column name ID, data type integer, length 4, identity. Yes, it is an identity column, and hence nulls and default values are not allowed. Color number, it's not an identity column. We don't want, it's just our choice, not we don't want nulls there. And we want to have default value 0 for some reason. And finally, you can read the last specifications for the color name, and working with that, we can add information into the table. So as we can insert into color sample values and just specify the value, column name and the value. So this is a column name and this is the value for it. We can also specify color name and value for it. And finally, over here, if we don't choose columns, we have to do a default and orange. Look back. The second column allows default value 0, and the last one does not. So we need to specify this too, because ID column is specified automatically, is next available value. And because we had 2 columns, we did not specify which column we want. We are assuming that both are needed, and we have to provide values for both. So we can also use null, and we can also use default values if such were specified, or no. So last line, when we used default values, the default value was null, was entered as null because there was none. And that is the result, and so that is a nice little example. All right, so now we want to insert data into a table from another table, and we can use it using a select. We can do that using a select statement. So insert into table name. We can optionally list columns, and then we are doing a subquery select column list from table source where, for example, where condition is fulfilled. So insert into invoice archive, select all from invoice copy where the balance due is 0. So notice that we don't need to have parentheses over here for this subquery select everything and so on. Now we can do an insert statement with a column list. We can explicitly list the columns to which we want to insert, and then we have to do the same in the select statement. And that can work nicely if you have a bunch of columns with where null values are allowed or where default values are allowed, and you just want to fill them in with null and default values. So you may have like 3 out of 10 columns which need to be specified. So that would be an interesting thing to do, a good thing to do in that case. All right, we arrived to the update statement. Update statement is for changing something about the table, and we can do that, for example, by condition. So we are updating a table, invoice copy. We are setting payment date to be this and payment total to be that, where invoice number is that. So basically this is very similar to a select statement. If instead of update we had a select, we would actually see one row.